For the first time in nearly a century, something deeply unusual is unfolding inside the United States. And it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not something that dominates daily political arguments. It's quieter than that. But in many ways, it may be more significant. More Americans appear to be leaving the country than coming in. And we are not talking about short vacations, temporary study abroad programs, or retirees experimenting with 6 months in a warmer climate. We are talking about families making permanent moves, mid-career professionals transferring their entire lives overseas, entrepreneurs relocating their businesses, parents withdrawing their children from American school systems and enrolling them in classrooms thousands of miles away. If you look back through modern American history, through wars, recessions, and political upheaval, you will struggle to find a comparable moment. Even during the Great Depression, when economic hardship was severe, the United States remained largely a destination country. People moved toward it, not away from it. Yet right now, something different seems to be taking shape. Foreign residency permits issued to Americans are climbing. Citizenship applications in European countries are reaching record highs. International university enrollment among American students is increasing. Independent data sources across multiple nations are flashing similar signals. Americans are quietly starting over somewhere else. The public conversation often highlighted across global entry news focuses heavily on falling immigration numbers and increased deportations as policy victories. On the surface, that framing suggests control and stability. But when you look beneath that headline, a far more complicated story begins to emerge. The Americans choosing to leave are not being forced out. They are not refugees. They are not fleeing collapse. They are opting out. And when citizens of the world's wealthiest and most powerful country begin voluntarily deciding that their future may feel safer, more stable, or simply less stressful somewhere else, that raises a much larger question. Is this just a political reaction to one election cycle? Is it primarily economic pressure building over time? Or are we witnessing the early phase of something deeper, a recalibration in how Americans evaluate their own country and their place within it? Some commentators have started calling this moment the Donald Dash. It's a headline-friendly label, and like most labels, it simplifies something far more complex. The name itself is not the most important part. What matters are the motivations underneath it. Hi, I'm Sofia, and today we're going to step away from partisan noise and examine what may actually be happening beneath the surface. Not social media outrage, not viral anecdotes, not emotionally charged political clips, but measurable demographic movement, real data, real decisions being made by real families. Because this is not about a handful of expats posting aesthetic photos from European cafes. This is about long-term consequences when working-age professionals, students, and families begin deciding their prospects might be stronger outside the United States. Let's begin with the numbers, because one of the most common pushbacks, frequently repeated in segments across global entry news, is straightforward. Where is the proof? And that is a fair question. The United States no longer comprehensively tracks its citizens when they leave the country. That system was largely phased out years ago. There is no single centralized database that tells us exactly how many Americans permanently relocate each year. No dashboard flashing warning signs. But when direct measurement is unavailable, analysts look at surrounding indicators. And right now, those indicators are aligning in ways that are difficult to ignore. Since the pandemic, foreign residency permits granted to Americans have surged across several countries. Portugal alone has seen its American resident population increase by more than 500% within just a few years. That is not a minor fluctuation. That is not statistical noise. That suggests structural movement. Ireland and Germany have both reported record inflows of U.S. citizens applying for residency. Applications for British and Irish citizenship have reached historic highs. Even formal requests to renounce U.S. citizenship, a serious and often expensive bureaucratic process involving interviews, documentation, and substantial fees, spiked sharply in 2024 ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration and have continued trending upward. And here is what makes this particularly notable. These data points are not coming from one centralized source. They are coming from different governments, tracking different administrative processes across different regions of the world. Residency approvals, citizenship filings, tax registrations, university admissions. Yet, despite being independent of one another, they are pointing in the same direction. It is not just about residency. More than 100,000 American students are now enrolled in universities abroad, another record. At the same time, international student enrollment within the United States has declined from previous peaks. That shift matters more than it may appear at first glance. International students often remain after graduation. They build companies. They work in technology, medicine, research. They become taxpayers. When outbound student mobility rises while inbound flows soften, that changes demographic math. Add to this the surge in U.S. passport applications over recent years. Add overseas property purchases by American buyers. Add relocation services reporting unprecedented demand from American clients. When you layer these independent indicators together, a broader pattern begins to emerge. This is no longer anecdotal, it is cumulative, and relocating internationally is not easy. It involves visa eligibility, tax restructuring, healthcare transitions, sometimes learning a new language, often leaving behind extended family networks. People do not uproot their lives casually. They do it when they believe the long-term trade-off justifies the short-term disruption. When I spent time in Portugal, what struck me most was not just the volume of Americans I encountered, it was who they were. These were not gap-year students. These were families with young children enrolled in Portuguese schools, professionals in their 30s and 40s working remotely or launching European branches of their businesses, retirees who had sold their homes in the United States and openly stated they had no intention of returning. When asked why they moved, their responses were not dramatic. They were not angry. They were measured and practical. I don't want to worry about gun violence in everyday spaces. I don't want my children participating in active shooter drills. I don't want to fear that a medical emergency could financially devastate us. I feel less stressed here. That phrase came up repeatedly, less stressed. In Portugal, gun violence is rare. School shootings are virtually non-existent. Healthcare costs are predictable and heavily regulated. Insurance premiums do not swing wildly year to year. Childcare, while not free, is significantly more affordable than in many major U.S. cities. The overall pace of life feels slower and less volatile. When you combine safety concerns, medical expenses, housing affordability, political polarization, and work-life balance pressures, what you are really measuring is cumulative stress. And importantly, none of the individuals I spoke with framed their decision as hatred toward America. Many still describe deep affection for American culture, innovation, and energy. What they described instead was calculation. They compared systems. They evaluated trade-offs. They assessed long-term quality of life for their children. Then they made a decision. This is what makes this moment distinct. It is not mass panic. It is not collapse. It is deliberate repositioning. And here is where the conversation becomes more complicated. The households most capable of relocating internationally are often the same households that contribute disproportionately to local economies. Skilled professionals, dual income earners, entrepreneurs, they pay taxes, they create jobs, they buy homes, they raise children who will eventually enter the workforce. When that demographic begins dispersing internationally, the impact does not appear immediately. It compounds gradually over time. It shows up later in labor markets, in school enrollment figures, in small business creation rates, in long-term GDP growth. So the data suggests measurable outward movement. Lived experiences suggest motivations tied to safety, stability, and predictability. But that still leaves a deeper question hanging in the air. Is this primarily political, or is it structural? If we reduce everything to politics alone, we risk missing the larger structural pressures that have been building quietly for years. It would be easy to say this is simply a reaction to one election, one administration, one personality, and yes, politics plays a role. But the groundwork for this moment was laid long before any single campaign rally or inauguration speech. Start with housing. In many major American cities, home prices have dramatically outpaced wage growth for over a decade. What used to be considered a starter home now feels permanently out of reach for large segments of the middle class. Rent burdens have climbed steadily, consuming higher percentages of monthly income. In some metropolitan areas, affordable housing inventory has nearly disappeared. For younger professionals especially, the traditional milestones of adulthood, buying a home, starting a family, building long-term equity, feel increasingly delayed or uncertain. Then layer in healthcare. The United States remains the only advanced economy without a universal health coverage model. Insurance premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket maximums can turn even insured households into financial tightrope walkers. A single, unexpected diagnosis can destabilize years of savings. Medical bankruptcy, while less common than headlines suggest, remains uniquely American compared to peer nations. For families running long-term financial projections, that uncertainty carries weight. Childcare adds another layer. In parts of the country, annual childcare costs rival in-state university tuition. For dual-income households, it often becomes a calculation of whether one parent's salary meaningfully exceeds the cost of care. Student loan debt continues shaping life decisions well into people's 30s and 40s. Add longer working hours and comparatively limited parental leave policies, and what emerges is not one overwhelming crisis, but a series of persistent stressors. When Gallup asked Americans whether they would leave the country permanently if they had the opportunity, 1 in 5 said yes. That figure is striking on its own, but what makes it more telling is the comparison. During the 2008 financial crisis, one of the most severe economic downturns in modern history, that number hovered closer to 1 in 10. It has doubled. The key phrase in that survey is not simply leave, it is if they had the opportunity. Because for many Americans, relocation is not financially or logistically feasible. Visas are complex, international moves are expensive, careers are often location dependent. Elderly parents may require care, children may be deeply rooted in communities. So when 20% express willingness in principle, the visible movement may represent only a fraction of underlying sentiment. At the same time, more than 100,000 American students are studying abroad, building global networks earlier than previous generations. Younger Americans are increasingly comfortable imagining futures that are not geographically tied to the United States. Meanwhile, inbound international student flows have fluctuated and in some periods declined from prior highs. When outbound mobility increases while inbound talent tightens, the demographic balance gradually shifts. Now, politics does matter. Donald Trump's second term expanded deportations, intensified immigration enforcement, and heightened tensions surrounding universities and speech. Supporters argue that these measures restore sovereignty and national order. Critics interpret them as signals of institutional instability. Regardless of one's position, perception alone can drive behavior. And right now, a portion of Americans perceive the political environment as more volatile than it was a decade ago. The phrase Donald Dash captures the idea that Trump's return accelerated decisions that were already under consideration. Citizenship renunciations rose ahead of his swearing in. Online relocation forums saw sharp increases in activity. International real estate agencies reported surges in American inquiries. But it is important to be precise here. Trump did not invent high housing prices. He did not create America's expensive healthcare structure. He did not single-handedly generate student debt burdens or childcare inflation. What his return may have signaled for some Americans is that the trajectory they were concerned about is not temporary. Historically, people leave countries when they lose confidence, economic confidence, political confidence, institutional confidence. During the Great Depression, Americans sought opportunity elsewhere. In other historical contexts, citizens fled authoritarian regimes, economic collapse, or war. The United States has almost always been the destination in those narratives. That is what makes this moment different. We are not talking about mass collapse. We are not talking about humanitarian crisis. We are observing incremental erosion of confidence among people who possess mobility. Confidence is intangible, but it is powerful. When professionals begin to believe that their long-term safety, healthcare security, work-life balance, and educational stability may be stronger elsewhere, they act on that belief. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. And once relocation becomes normalized within social circles, the psychological barrier drops. When your colleague moves to Lisbon, your friend relocates to Berlin, your cousin settles in Dublin, the idea no longer feels extreme. It feels practical. That is how demographic shifts begin, quietly, incrementally, often before policymakers fully recognize the trend. Now here is where the story becomes even more complex. Over the past several years, influential figures in business and politics have repeatedly warned about declining birth rates in the United States. The concern is straightforward. Without population growth, economic growth slows. Fewer workers mean reduced innovation, less tax revenue, increased pressure on Social Security and Medicare, and slower GDP expansion. The argument centers on long-term national strength. But population growth does not come only from births. It comes from people. From working-age adults building companies, paying taxes, and raising families. When immigration is restricted while some citizens relocate abroad, pressure builds at both ends of the demographic funnel. If even a modest percentage of working-age professionals leave each year, engineers, doctors, software developers, entrepreneurs, the loss compounds. You lose their present contributions and their future productivity. You lose the companies they might have founded. You lose the children they might have raised within U.S. borders. Those births do not vanish, they occur somewhere else. In demographic terms, that is not disappearance. It is redistribution. Social Security depends on a stable ratio of workers to retirees. Medicare relies on a broad tax base. Advanced economies depend on talent density to sustain innovation. Historically, immigration acted as America's demographic shock absorber, offsetting aging trends and supporting workforce replenishment. Silicon Valley, higher education, medical research, all deeply shaped by immigrant talent. When political rhetoric focuses heavily on limiting entry while outward mobility increases, a structural tension emerges. You cannot simultaneously warn about falling birth rates while narrowing the working age population through both reduced immigration and increased emigration. The arithmetic becomes difficult to ignore. Countries like Japan and parts of Europe have already experienced the strain of aging populations without sufficient workforce replenishment. The United States historically avoided the harshest version of that scenario because of immigration and comparatively higher fertility rates. If both soften at the same time, the buffer weakens. This does not mean open borders are a simple solution. Immigration policy is complex. Security matters. Integration matters. Labor market dynamics matter. But demographic math remains unforgiving, and all of this brings us back to confidence. When citizens believe their long-term future, economically, socially, personally, may be stronger elsewhere, they hedge. When potential immigrants perceive fewer opportunities or higher barriers, they redirect. In a world of remote work and digital infrastructure, mobility is easier than at any previous point in history. Governments actively compete for high-income earners, investors, and entrepreneurs. Entire visa categories are designed specifically to attract mobile professionals. The real competition today is not just domestic political control, it is global quality of life. The United States is not collapsing. It is not descending into chaos. It still holds enormous structural advantages: world-class universities, deep capital markets, cultural influence that spans continents, technological leadership that shapes entire industries. But advantages can erode if they are assumed to be permanent. And in a world where highly skilled workers have options, assumption is no longer enough. For decades, the global equation was simple. People wanted to come to America. Increasingly, that equation feels more balanced. Professionals are comparing healthcare systems. Parents are comparing school safety statistics. Young couples are comparing housing affordability. Entrepreneurs are comparing tax structures and regulatory environments. Families are comparing parental leave policies and childcare costs. They are running spreadsheets on their own lives. And once those comparisons become normalized, mobility stops feeling radical. It starts feeling strategic. This is where the conversation shifts from individual lifestyle choices to long-term national trajectory. Because if outward mobility continues steadily, not explosively, not dramatically, but persistently, the effects will not appear in a single shocking headline. They will appear gradually, in tighter labor markets, in slower small business formation, in regional population declines, in university enrollment shifts, in funding gaps for entitlement programs decades down the line. Demographic change rarely announces itself in real time. It accumulates. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, students who do not return after graduate school abroad, entrepreneurs who choose to incorporate overseas, families who plant permanent roots elsewhere. Over time, those decisions become statistics. Those statistics become trends, and trends reshape economic and social outcomes in ways that are difficult to reverse. Whenever this topic surfaces, a personal question inevitably follows. Would you leave? It is a fair question, because analyzing a trend like this naturally leads to self-reflection. If you have portable skills, if you qualify for a remote work visa, if you possess ancestry that allows dual citizenship, do you at least consider the possibility? For many Americans today, the answer is not driven by anger. It is driven by optionality. Some hold dual citizenship through parents or grandparents. Others qualify for residency through investment programs or professional visas in Europe, Canada, Australia, or parts of Asia. A generation ago, these pathways were less visible and less accessible. Today, governments openly advertise them. Countries compete for high-income earners. They market lifestyle, stability, and predictability. An entire industry now exists to facilitate relocation. International tax advisors, cross-border estate planners, global real estate firms, relocation consultants, and thriving expatriate communities that smooth cultural transitions. The logistical friction has decreased. But relocation is never purely financial. It is emotional, cultural, psychological. It means distance from extended family, distance from lifelong friends, distance from familiar institutions and traditions. It means trading familiarity for a different form of stability. That trade-off is not simple. Personally, I am not planning an exit, but I understand why others contemplate it. I understand parents who feel exhausted by anxiety around school safety. I understand families who have examined healthcare cost projections and decided they do not want to gamble on one unexpected diagnosis. I understand young professionals staring at housing prices and wondering whether the traditional American dream is geographically out of reach. Understanding motivation does not require declaring the country beyond repair. It requires acknowledging that perception shapes behavior. If enough citizens perceive instability, financial instability, political volatility, social fragmentation, they will hedge. Some will move assets abroad. Some will apply for second passports. Some will test 1 year overseas and quietly decide not to return. These are not dramatic exits. They are calculated adjustments. Historically, America's greatest strength has not simply been GDP or military power, it has been magnetism, the belief that ambition is rewarded, that talent rises, that the future expands rather than constricts, that upward mobility, while imperfect, remains attainable. If Americans themselves begin questioning that promise in measurable numbers, that signal carries weight. The question is not whether citizens have the right to leave. Of course they do. The deeper question is why increasing numbers feel compelled to explore that option. Is this a temporary spike tied to one political era, or is it the early stage of longer demographic recalibration? Are we witnessing short-term frustration or gradual erosion of confidence? Because once a mindset shift takes hold, once leaving no longer feels extreme but pragmatic, the flow can become self-sustaining. Networks reinforce decisions, information spreads, barriers feel lower with each successful relocation story. And reversing a self-sustaining demographic trend is far more difficult than preventing it. America is still powerful, still innovative, still home to extraordinary opportunity. Millions around the world still aspire to build lives there. But for the first time in modern memory, a growing number of Americans are looking outward and asking whether their next chapter might unfold somewhere else. That alone makes this moment historically significant. Whether the so-called Donald Dash becomes a brief footnote or the beginning of deeper transformation depends on what happens next. On policy decisions, on housing reform, on healthcare affordability, on how immigration is balanced with demographic realities, on whether leaders address the stress points, pushing families to reconsider their future. Because when citizens with options begin exercising those options, the message is not subtle. It is a request, sometimes quiet, sometimes unspoken, for stability, predictability, and renewed confidence. History shows that when such signals are acknowledged and addressed, countries adapt and strengthen. When they are dismissed as anecdotal or exaggerated, trends harden. The United States stands at an unusual crossroads, not one defined by collapse, but by comparison, not by crisis alone, but by calculation. In a globally connected era where talent is mobile and opportunity is distributed, confidence becomes currency. And the most important question may not be how many Americans are leaving this year. It may be whether enough of them are quietly deciding that their future feels more secure somewhere else, and what that says about the trajectory of the country they once assumed they would never leave.